Hello, this is Dr. Mark L. Teague. Welcome to everyone. I want to welcome you to the A Working Man's Guide broadcast. This show will be all about the American working class. It is my firm belief that America has always been a working class nation and will always be that. And the more we embrace that reality and build our lifestyles, our habits, our principles, and especially our public policies around that, the better off we'll be. What I want to do in this broadcast is cover key topics that affect the American working class, and I want to start with the most important topic of all, the U.S. national debt. That is the most threatening feature that faces every American citizen. It's bigger than Russia, it's bigger than China, it's bigger than jihad, it's bigger than any foreign threat, and it is the largest single threat that an American citizen will face. I want to look at the history of it, the status, how we've gotten where we are, why that has happened, and what we can do about it, solutions. So please join me in this series of broadcasts as we go through this. And you can get more information in my book, A Working Man's Guide. I suggest you check this out. You can find this on the website, www.aworkingmansguide.com. Drop the apostrophe, keep the A, and that'll take you right to it. Let's start with definitions. You'll see my chart here. We're going to be spending some time on this. First of all, the best way to look at the U.S. national debt is as a ratio. You take the total debt, and I do use total here, Social Security debt, government debt held by our government, other institutions, all federal public debt at the federal level is included in the debt numbers here. That's the top number. And then the bottom number is the economy itself. It's a debt to GDP ratio, as you can see here. That's the best way to get a perspective on it. How much debt do we have with respect to the size of our economy? And this is at the same point in time. So you create the ratio in a given point in time. And it's gross domestic product, meaning the size of our domestic economy. We've taken out trade flows, imports and exports, and focus on the 50 states comprising the U.S. We're going to look at a ratio. That's the best way to look at it. It'll be the total public debt, all debt, divided by the gross domestic product, GDP, at various points in time. Now, I want to point your attention to this chart. This is a full history of the U.S. national debt. We go all the way back to 1789, right after the Constitution was ratified and we formed a government. We became an official country. The Revolutionary War was won several years prior. We had the Constitutional Convention. It was signed and ratified, and we started with debt from the Revolutionary War. Now you're going to see here our entire history with public debt, and we're going to dig into why we have it, how we got where we are today, what it means, and what we need to do about it. We start at 1789 here. That's our earliest data point, right after we formed a government. Note again that we had a debt to GDP ratio of 28%. That became 32% at the end of the Civil War, 36% at the end of World War I. Notice a couple things. Wars are getting more expensive, and then World War II is to come. But notice this period here, some 30 years before the Civil War. We had virtually no debt whatsoever. So our response after the Revolutionary War was to pay that down, get it down to nothing, and it stayed that way until 1861, when the South fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. That took us up to about 32% to win that war. Notice again, we start at 1789. It's 28%. We're using a ratio, debt to GDP. Notice it got down, as I pointed out last post, it got down to next to nothing for about 30-something years prior to the Civil War. We had no debt whatsoever. We paid it down after the Revolutionary War. The Civil War took us up to about 32% in debt to GDP ratio. We paid that down to a very low level. World War I came along. That took us to about 36%. We were in the midst of paying that down. Then we get into the Great Depression. We start incurring debt, the FDR New Deal programs, to pay that off. And then along comes World War II, and that spikes us. To win that war, it took us to 122%. At that point, by far the highest amount of debt we had ever incurred. Notice 28% for the Revolutionary War, 32% for the Civil War, 36% for World War I. And then we have the Great Depression right here, spiked us up to a little over 40%. And then along came World War II, took us to 122%, the highest debt we had ever seen until modern times. And notice what happened after every war. We paid it down. We paid down the Revolutionary War. We paid down the Civil War. We were in the midst of paying down World War I. And then World War II that debt was taken down to somewhere in the 30% range, very manageable range. And then we get into more modern times. We've been working through the history of the U.S. national debt. I'm going to take a short break from that and jump to current status. What's happened since November and with the Trump administration. I just want to say the election on November the 5th, from a fiscal standpoint, was very much the right thing to do. Thank you to the American voter. In the Department of Government Efficiency, the actions so far that Trump has put in place with the help of Elon Musk, it's exactly what we need. We need much more of it. I would just say this to you, the American citizen, the American working class, keep up the pressure. Don't let your politicians off the hook. Keep writing, keep calling. The actions that are being taken now to reduce spending and make it more responsible need to be deeper, broader, and most importantly, they need to be permanent. Republicans have the votes. Get it in the budget. Make it permanent. Make it a part of the federal apparatus. That is what we need now. So keep up the pressure. Let's get back to our history of the U.S. national debt, specifically the debt to GDP ratio. But look at the clear trend over our history. Wars, Revolutionary, Civil, World War I, World War II, Cold War. Win a war and pay it down. That was our history for many, many years, with one exception, the Great Depression right here. That represented about 25% of our GDP in ratio terms right here, 1932 on up to coming into World War II. Something very interesting over history. We only used debt to win wars, and then we would pay it down, with that one exception, the Great Depression right here. That was about a 25 percentage point spread. And I'm going to make some very clear statements about policy. The increase in spending was an abysmal failure. That did not end the Great Depression. It dragged on for almost a full decade, a full 9 years. And there were structural issues that caused the Great Depression. First of all, the banking industry was under nothing resembling the safety and soundness structures, a regulatory structure that we have today, like the FDIC, et cetera. That put the banking industry in a high-risk position. As a response to the 1929 crash and subsequent depression, there were two things that done by governmental policy. One was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. That was a disaster. That greatly increased the severity of the Great Depression. And the Federal Reserve cranked up interest rates and tightened the money supply. Exactly the opposite of what you should do in a deep recession. Those things guaranteed the continuance of the Great Depression, caused it and made it far worse than it should have been. So the Great Depression was not solved by federal spending. It was caused by inadequate policy and inadequate policy measures. That's the root of it. This one exception, the Great Depression, serves to make a point, and I hope we learn this and never forget it. This amount, about 25% of GDP, was spent on debt as a response to the Great Depression. It was an abject failure. It did not work. The causes of the Great Depression were systemic, were institutional, and until those were corrected, the Great Depression did not end. Those are the lessons we need to learn. So as we look at the history of national debt, what works and what doesn't, keep that in mind. So I want to focus now on the period of the 1980s. Our history has clearly been fight and win wars using debt and then pay it down, with the exception of the Great Depressions. Now here we get into 1981. Let's start right here. That's Reagan's first budget. And we start to build debt. We start to mix the picture now a little bit. That was absolutely to win the Cold War, and that was a genius move on the part of Ronald Reagan. The Cold War was won without firing a shot. We basically spent the Soviet Union into oblivion. We had Star Wars Defense Initiative, the B-1 bomber, the military buildup to put pressure on the Soviet Union, including diplomatic and political pressure, and it was magnificently successful. It turned the entire globe, basically. It rewrote boundaries and rewrote international politics. So that was a massive success. We're talking about the Cold War, specifically from 1981 through to about 1989, 1990. That was won by the Reagan policy of peace through strength. He focused on defense spending, but from a national debt perspective, it wasn't quite that clear. There was a fair amount of domestic spending in that as well. The farm programs, food stamps, etc., that increased a great deal as well. You can break that down looking at OMB data. That's where we started to mix things. Our policies were not so clear. Up until then, with the exception of the Great Depression, that's the only reason we took on debt, was to fight and win a war. We started to change our habits through the 80s. And then as we get into more modern times, we took those worst habits and made them permanent. They have hurt us dearly. So this is where we need to make a change. So we're getting up closer to modern times. We can see in the 80s, the national debt was used to win the Cold War. A brilliant move, but it wasn't that clean. Domestic spending was increased as well. Although in the Clinton years, we definitely got back to paying it down. That was largely through economic growth. Bill Clinton deserves credit. He believed in a strong economy, and he delivered. We had exactly that. We did not exercise the discipline we had in the past, though, in terms of fiscal restraint and bringing debt under control. We're starting to develop bad habits. You can see those here. There was not much of a decrease, and nothing like there should have been. As we come out of the Cold War, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. That should have been a peace dividend. We should have been paying debt down. Not that much, maybe 12, 15 points at most. It's nothing like we did in our historical years. Notice here, some would say the U.S. government has always had debt. That's not true. For about 30 years prior to the Civil War, we had no debt. None whatsoever. Now we're becoming addicted to it in modern times. We see it here in the early 2000s that the financial crisis, we decided to fund the whole thing, the entire recovery on debt. Our bad habits are becoming permanent, and that should be alarming to all of us. It must change. So at this point, we're using debt to funnel and fuel spending of every kind. There's no recovery. There's no pay down. Look at the end of the 07 to 09 financial crisis. No payoff whatsoever. In fact, we're actually ticking up a little bit. We've bought into the notion, the lie basically, that federal deficit and debt doesn't matter. In fact, you heard those statements made in the political realm. The federal debt doesn't matter. That's ridiculous. The federal debt is something that doesn't matter at all until it does, and then it's the only thing that matters. So you can see after the financial crisis, no recovery, no pay down. We had recovery in the U.S. economy, but the federal government continues to pile up debt at alarming rates. No pay down whatsoever. A sharp departure from our history. And then, of course, along comes COVID. That destroys our federal budget. We had the disastrous policies of shutdowns. We tried to close the entire economy. That was a financial disaster. And evidence now shows was not effective in terms of controlling the spread of the disease. So hopefully again we'll learn some lessons from some very bad policies. But our debt went through the roof. This is 133%. So out of the 07-09 financial crisis, we were about at 100%. Our debt was the same size as our economy. COVID comes along, we're 33% larger in our debt than we have in our entire gross domestic product. So that is simply not sustainable. Let's start to look at the effects of keeping that up. As we get into modern times, it's seemingly we lost our minds. We start using debt to fuel everything, all manner of federal spending, And it becomes baked and embedded as a very bad habit. You see it in modern times. 133% debt to GDP ratio. We recovered a little bit, paid that down a bit. Actually, some adjustments in the economic numbers had a lot to do with that. We're down around 122%. That's where we were to win World War II. So think of it like this. In modern times, we have spent the equivalent of what it took to win World War II. Where's the war? There was no war. We spent that money on domestic expenditures, on debt. That is not sustainable. So our history has been eroded. We've lost good habits. We've taken on bad habits. Now we're going to start to talk about the consequence, the impact of that. I'm going to go back to the time series a little bit and focus on the single greatest consequence. It started in the 1980s, about 1981. That's when current trends started. I made a comment about the Reagan administration and their spending, and one thing in particular is about fiscal restraint. I want to be clear, the Reagan administration did bring fiscal restraint. They're actually one of the few administrations to decrease federal spending year over year. But there was something else going on in the middle of that. Public attitudes are starting to change. We started to get gridlock, started to settle in between political left and political right. And that has continued to today, and this is what it has brought us. So the left looks at the national debt and says, you need to let it run. It will force a tax increase. The political right looks at the national debt and has said, we need to let it run. It will force a spending cut. Well, we've just been playing chicken. Well, the result of that is we've had a head-on collision. We are now drowning in debt. That is the number one consequence. You can see it here, 133%, and there are significant fallout effects from that. The first one, you can see we hit 133% during COVID. We currently stand at about 122%. That matches our all-time high in World War II. And here's the consequence. Our historical pattern of using debt to win wars is now no longer possible. The single largest public good that the federal government provides to each and every citizen is national defense. The ability to keep us safe, to protect our liberties, protect us from harm and foreign enemies. National defense. Ladies and gentlemen, if World War III breaks out today, we are in serious trouble. We cannot respond. I've flipped out charts here. I'm going to go to an OMB chart, Office of Management and Budget. This tracks the percentage of federal outlays and which category they fall into. So we track that month by month. Every dollar that's spent by the federal government, what does it go to in payment? This tracks the percentage of federal payments that go to direct payments to individuals, social welfare direct payments. I want you to notice a couple of things. In 1952, following World War II, that was at 13%. And then you can see it's almost a straight line, some variation, but a straight trend up to today's value of 71%. So we went from 13 cents on the dollar, federal outlays, going to social welfare direct payments. We are now at 71 cents per dollar going to individuals. That's a significant implication regarding our debt. What that does is create a squeeze. We have done this on debt. We've done this on the national credit card. Well, rather than investment expenditures such as winning wars, national security, etc., things like that, we're paying each other's bills. That's what we have done. Well, you paint yourself into a corner. We cannot afford to do that on debt. We need to get back to a very simple maxim. Each of us needs to make our own money and pay our own bills. That's a very simple conclusion. We put ourselves in a jam by doing this on credit. We flipped out charts again here. Now we're looking at annual household income, and this is inflation adjusted. One of the significant impacts of government spending, excessive government spending, is inflation. You could argue there's a strong case to be made that all government spending, especially at the federal level, is inflationary. But some federal spending is necessary. We need it. Basic infrastructure, it must be done. So we absorb that in the economy. But when you have the kind of debt-fueled excessive spending that we've seen the last several years, it will show up in the economy. We saw that since 2021. You can see the drop in household income. That is driven by the impacts of COVID and the 2021 omnibus package, which greatly increased federal spending. That was a disaster. And that resulted in the ouster of the Biden administration in the November elections. That was the number one reason, for sure. This drop right here. In fact, as you look at the history of this line, this is from 1967 forward, almost every one of these drops in income corresponds to a change in the political administration. People do vote with their pocketbook, and that's a very good thing. What we saw in 2021 and going forward, this drop in incomes here as a result of inflation, that's an indicator, a marker. This was a very light touch of what inflation can do to household incomes. If we continue on with the burden of debt that we carry, we get into a bond market crisis. That will make this look like child's play. I want to refer us now to my book, A Working Man's Guide, Chapter 7. There's full detail in this. I'm going to focus now on a bond market crisis. What we saw as a result of the inflation following the 21 reckless fiscal spending, that's just a precursor. That's just a light indicator of what a bond market crisis looks like. A bond market crisis is the public form of bankruptcy. You see, nations don't go bankrupt like individuals do. If you take out a loan with the bank that you can't pay back, you're going to declare bankruptcy. There's no such thing in the public realm, but we do have bond market ratings. And when those go south, those go to the toilet, it is very painful for the citizens of that country. A bond market crisis, again, is the public form of a bankruptcy. So there's something that should alarm us, that should give us an indicator of how close we are to that. The interest expense on federal debt is now the second largest item in the budget. It is larger than national defense. It is larger than everything except direct payment benefits to individuals. That should be a bright, flashing red flag that we cannot ignore. And if we ignore it, we're looking at the erosion of our dollar. We no longer have sound money, and we're looking at the erosion of private property rights. Here's how a bond market crisis plays out. When you owe that amount of debt, there is a risk assessment, a risk rating on those bonds. If our risk of payment starts to increase or risk of non-payment, the interest rate is going to increase on those bonds, if anyone will borrow them at all. As that happens, if your interest rate increases, the interest expense increases, your risk increases, which increases your interest rate, which increases your interest expense, which increases your risk. You can see the spiral. The downward spiral you get into, that is disastrous. That means an erosion of personal income through the lack of sound money. The currency is being devaluated, and you have an erosion of property rights, because what do you think bureaucrats are going to fall back on? Taxation, regulation, confiscation. That's where they go. They go after your property. And I just want to summarize the major negative impacts. Because of that, you cannot defend your country properly. If a major war breaks out, we have no dry powder. We have no capacity to build up and win that war decisively like we have done in our past. You cannot have sound money. Our currency is eroded through inflation. That means your incomes are going down. Your well-being is directly impacted. And private property rights are under threat, under siege. Where does the government go to pay its bills? It goes to its people. It seizes property. It seizes income. It seizes assets. That's what happens. So for those that would say the national debt doesn't matter, I say you're a fool. The implications are deep and consequential. We must change our habits. With the national debt levels the way we have them now, we cannot defend our country properly. We cannot win the next major war. We can't have sound money. It's eroded through inflation. And private property rights are eroded because that debt must be met.
But we've got this enormous federal budget deficit. It's a $2 trillion deficit. It keeps growing. It's a real wake-up call for me was looking at seeing that the interest payments on national debt exceeded the Defense Department budget. And that was only growing over time, which meant if we didn't do something about this, then there won't be any money for anything. We'll just be servicing debt. Really, I just don't want America to go bankrupt.
So with those significant items, and that's just a starter list, we could go on and on, but those three things alone should alarm all of us. So let's look at solutions. What do we do? Many would say tax the rich. That's a common phenomenon. Just tax the high earners and everything, tax the wealthy and everything will be fine. Well, let's start to take a look at that. I want to look at some data from the IRS and the Tax Foundation. Let's look at who pays taxes now. And this is from the year 2021. It's been true for many years. You can pick any one of the last many years and you will find this to be true. The top 1% of earners already pay almost half, 45.8% of all federal taxes. The top 5% pay 2/3, 65.7%. The top half pay 97.7%. The bottom half of wage earners in the United States pay only 2.3% of federal income tax. So to those of you that would say we need to tax the rich, we already do that. We've been doing that for years. While we accumulate this unsustainable level of debt, we've been doing that all along. I'm sorry, folks, but that idea is worn out. It's not sufficient. It won't get the job done. The rich pay by far the majority of federal taxes. You can see that distribution from the last episode. The next idea is, well, what about net worth? What about wealth? What about assets? The richest families have so much more than anyone else. Why shouldn't we tax that? Well, let's take a look. Let's look at Federal Reserve data, the Board of Governors. First of all, the national debt, total public debt as of today, is $36.22 trillion. Well, if we look at the wealthiest households as ranked by the Federal Reserve, you can see where we stand with that regard. If you take the top 0.1%, that's 1/10 of 1%, well, you don't have enough, 22.14 trillion. You could confiscate and take everything they have and not get what you need. Let's take the top 1% of American households. That gives you basically $49.5 trillion. You have enough, but think about what that means. You have to take almost everything they have. Well, what is that wealth? It's stock, it's companies, shares, land, assets, homes, etc. You're talking about losing tens of thousands of jobs, reshaping the American economy in a devastating way. You take us to Venezuela. That's where we go. So you need to stop and think that through, what it means. Well, we looked at the top two groups before. Let's look at the top 10%. There is about $108 trillion in that group, so you could spread it out. I mean, you only need about 1/3 of what they have. Well, you still have the same problem. That wealth is in company shares, in companies. It's engaged in production. It's in personal assets. It's in private property. You're going to completely reshape and essentially destroy the American economy. And here's another problem. You only get to do that once. You solve the debt. Well, the debt doesn't go away. It's continuing to accumulate. We've added over $1 trillion in the last year. We haven't solved anything. So you've wrecked the economy. You've not solved a thing. There is no solution, ladies and gentlemen, other than going back to the basic maxim. We need to make our own money and pay our own bills. We've accumulated this debt, $36 trillion, by trying to pay each other's bills. That has to stop. Here's where we have to understand an ironclad rule, a deep, abiding principle within economics that can't be compromised. If you look at the things that are required for a free market to prosper, for people to find prosperity, for household well-being to increase, there's something at the bottom of that you must have, and that is secure private property rights. There is no substitute for that. It's a must-have. If you destroy those, you destroy our ability to create wealth. That's an ironclad principle, so we must honor those. They must be intact for the United States to be a prosperous nation. You must have secure private property rights. It's the only way for prosperity to continue. I need to know what is mine, you need to know what is yours, and then we can trade. We can produce, we can buy and sell, and prosperity ensues. There's no substitute for that. It's a must-have. So as we get into solutions on the national debt, here's where we stand. It's very hard to argue that the federal government has a revenue problem. They have plenty of revenue. It's very easy to argue that the federal government has a spending problem. The feds spend too much, and that's been true for quite some time. So here's where we get into the answer. In my book, A Working Man's Guide, in chapter 7, I detail this entire problem, and I have 10 solutions. The very first one, the most important one, is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. It's time to bake fiscal responsibility into law. That will help ensure that we are a prosperous nation for generations to come. There's no end. Ladies and gentlemen, if we solve this national debt problem, I don't see much of anything standing in our way. We could be the most prosperous, most free nation that the world has ever seen with no end in sight. Thank you for joining me. Let's get that done. Take care.